The self-respect that makes avoidance take you seriously. Imagine spending months trying to be more understanding, more patient, more available, more forgiving, only to wake up one day and realize that the harder you've worked to be chosen, the less seriously you've been treated. Imagine looking back at every extra text, every benefit of the doubt, every moment you swallowed your own needs to keep the peace, and wondering why none of it created the respect you hoped it would. This is the painful puzzle many people face when dealing with avoidance. They assume that more effort will produce more connection, more understanding will produce more commitment, more patience will produce more appreciation. Yet over and over again they discover something frustrating. The very behaviors they believe will bring an avoidant closer often end up pushing respect further away. And if you've ever felt exhausted from trying to prove your value to someone who seemed emotionally distant, this video is for you. Because what makes an avoidant take someone seriously has far less to do with chasing love and far more to do with something many people accidentally abandon in the process: self-respect. And before we go deeper, subscribe if you're tired of surface-level relationship advice. Because the psychology underneath avoidant behavior is often very different from what most people are taught, and understanding it can completely change how you see your relationships. One of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is assuming that effort alone creates value. When the avoidant becomes distant, they give more. When the avoidant becomes inconsistent, they become more understanding. When communication decreases, they increase their own investment to compensate. It feels logical because most healthy relationships thrive on effort. The problem is that avoidant dynamics often operate differently. The more desperate someone becomes to preserve the connection, the more they unintentionally communicate that they are willing to sacrifice their own needs to keep access to the relationship. And while this may come from love, it rarely creates respect. In fact, it often does the opposite. Because when someone repeatedly teaches another person that they will remain available regardless of how they are treated, the relationship slowly loses its sense of balance. The avoidant begins experiencing the connection as something that requires less effort to maintain, not necessarily because they are malicious, but because human beings naturally respond to what is consistently reinforced. This is why so many people end up feeling trapped in a painful cycle. They keep giving more in hopes of receiving more, while the relationship quietly drifts further away from mutual investment. What they don't realize is that the solution is rarely found in increasing effort. It is found in increasing self-respect. And self-respect is often misunderstood. Many people imagine it as confidence, independence, or even emotional toughness. But genuine self-respect is something much deeper. It is the quiet belief that your value does not increase or decrease based on another person's attention. It is the ability to care deeply about someone while still honoring your own needs. It is remaining connected to yourself even when you feel emotionally attached to another person. Avoidants notice this more than most people realize. They may not consciously think about it, but they instinctively respond to emotional independence, not because they dislike closeness, but because self-respect removes pressure from the relationship. Someone with genuine self-respect does not make another person responsible for their self-worth. They do not require constant reassurance to feel valuable. They do not collapse emotionally every time uncertainty appears. This creates a completely different dynamic. The relationship feels lighter, healthier, more voluntary. The avoidant no longer feels like they are carrying the weight of someone else's emotional stability. And ironically, this often creates more space for connection than emotional dependence ever could. The avoidant begins interacting with a person who wants the relationship rather than needs it to survive. That distinction changes everything. The shift becomes especially noticeable when someone stops seeking validation. This is one of the most powerful changes that can occur in any avoidant dynamic. Many people spend enormous amounts of energy trying to convince the avoidant of their value. They want to be appreciated, recognized, prioritized, and chosen, so they search constantly for signs of interest, signs of commitment, signs that the relationship matters. But the more validation becomes the goal, the more power is handed away. Every unanswered message becomes emotionally significant. Every moment of distance becomes a source of anxiety. Every inconsistency feels like a threat to self-worth. Then something remarkable happens when self-respect begins growing. The focus starts shifting inward. Instead of asking, how do I make them see my value, the question becomes, why am I forgetting my value whenever they pull away? That single shift changes the emotional energy of the entire relationship. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone desperately trying to earn approval. They are interacting with someone who already understands their worth. And confidence of this kind carries a different presence. It is not loud, it is not demanding, it does not announce itself. Yet it is incredibly difficult to ignore, because people are naturally drawn toward those who do not need constant confirmation to believe in themselves. This leads directly into one of the hardest truths for many people to accept. Over-pursuing almost always lowers your value in an avoidant dynamic. Not because caring is unattractive, not because effort is wrong, but because excessive pursuit often communicates fear rather than confidence. Think about what happens psychologically when one person is doing nearly all of the emotional chasing. They are initiating most conversations, creating most opportunities for connection, carrying most of the emotional labor, managing most of the uncertainty. Over time, the relationship becomes unbalanced. The avoidant starts feeling less urgency because the connection is constantly being maintained for them. Meanwhile, the pursuer becomes increasingly invested because they have invested so much effort already. This imbalance creates a dynamic where one person's value feels increasingly obvious while the other person's value feels increasingly taken for granted. Self-respect interrupts this pattern. It introduces limits, it introduces reciprocity. It reminds both people that relationships are meant to be mutual. The avoidant may not consciously recognize what is changing, but they feel it. They feel the absence of excessive pursuit. They feel the reduction in pressure. They feel the difference between someone who is trying to convince them to stay and someone who knows they will be okay regardless of the outcome. And that is often the moment things begin shifting. Because the people who command the deepest respect are rarely the ones trying hardest to prove their worth. They are the ones who quietly understand it without needing anyone else's permission. And once a person begins recognizing their own value without constantly seeking validation, another transformation starts taking place. They stop trying to convince the avoidant of things that should never have required convincing in the first place. This is a difficult shift because many people unknowingly spend enormous amounts of emotional energy presenting evidence for why they deserve better treatment. They explain their loyalty, they explain their intentions, they explain their feelings, they explain why the relationship matters. And while honest communication is important, there is a subtle difference between expressing yourself and campaigning for your worth. The moment you start trying to persuade someone that you are valuable, you have already placed yourself in a position beneath the very thing you are trying to prove. Self-respect changes that entirely. It understands that value is demonstrated through how you live, how you treat people, and how you carry yourself, not through endless arguments designed to gain recognition. Avoidants often respond strongly to this shift because it removes a dynamic they have come to expect. They are no longer dealing with someone who is chasing approval. They are dealing with someone whose actions quietly communicate, "This is who I am, and whether you recognize it or not does not change its truth." That kind of confidence creates a different atmosphere. It removes desperation from the interaction. It removes the need to constantly negotiate for attention, and suddenly the relationship begins operating on a foundation of choice rather than persuasion. This naturally leads into something avoidants often respect far more than most people realize: boundaries. Many people assume that being endlessly accommodating is the best way to keep an avoidant comfortable. They become flexible with plans, flexible with communication, flexible with treatment, and flexible with expectations. At first glance, this seems compassionate. In reality, it can slowly erode self-respect. Boundaries are not punishments. They are not walls. They are not attempts to control another person. They are simply clear statements about what you are willing and unwilling to accept in your life. Avoidants may resist boundaries in certain moments, but deep down they often respect them because boundaries create clarity. They remove guesswork. They establish reality. Someone with healthy boundaries does not need to threaten, beg, or manipulate. They simply understand where they end and where another person begins. This creates an emotional structure that feels surprisingly stable. People-pleasing, on the other hand, often creates confusion. The avoidant senses that the other person is abandoning their own needs in order to maintain harmony. Even if they cannot articulate it, they feel the imbalance. Boundaries communicate strength because they demonstrate self-awareness. They show that a person values themselves enough to protect their emotional well-being, and when self-respect becomes visible through boundaries, it becomes much harder for anyone to take that person lightly. Eventually, there comes a moment where boundaries are no longer theoretical. They become real through action. This is where self-respect becomes impossible to fake. Anyone can talk about standards. Anyone can talk about knowing their worth. The true test arrives when those values are challenged. What happens when promises are repeatedly broken? What happens when inconsistency becomes a pattern? What happens when respect is not being reciprocated? Many people continue tolerating behavior that deeply hurts them because they are afraid that walking away will cost them the relationship. Yet self-respect operates differently. It understands that staying in situations that repeatedly damage your well-being carries a cost as well. The power of calmly walking away from disrespect is not found in making someone miss you. It is found in refusing to participate in dynamics that require you to abandon yourself. This is one of the strongest messages you can ever communicate, not through anger, not through revenge, not through emotional explosions, through quiet action, through the willingness to step back when your needs are consistently ignored. Avoidants often take this more seriously than endless conversations because consequences create reality. Words can be debated, actions cannot. When someone consistently demonstrates that they are willing to leave situations that do not align with their values, they become significantly harder to dismiss. Their self-respect is no longer an idea, it becomes something visible. At the same time, another quality begins separating itself from people-pleasing behavior, and that quality is emotional stability. One of the greatest misconceptions in relationships is that emotional strength means feeling less. It does not. Emotional strength means remaining connected to yourself while feeling deeply. It means responding thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. It means maintaining your center even when uncertainty appears. Avoidants often notice this because emotional stability reduces pressure. When someone reacts intensely to every fluctuation in attention, every delayed response, or every moment of distance, the relationship starts revolving around emotional management. The avoidant begins feeling responsible for constantly regulating another person's emotional state. This can create exhaustion and withdrawal. Emotional stability creates a very different experience. It communicates that while the relationship matters, the person's entire sense of well-being does not depend upon every interaction going perfectly. They are capable of handling disappointment without collapsing. They are capable of experiencing uncertainty without becoming consumed by it. They are capable of maintaining perspective during difficult moments. This quality tends to command respect because it reflects inner security. It demonstrates that the relationship is part of their life, not the center of their identity. And paradoxically, this emotional grounding often creates a stronger sense of connection because it removes the fear of being emotionally overwhelmed. What many people never realize is that avoidants sometimes observe these qualities through situations that feel like setbacks. There are moments when distance appears, communication decreases, or emotional availability becomes inconsistent. While this is often driven by the avoidant's own internal struggles, it can also reveal something important about the other person's relationship with themselves. In a sense, these moments become an unspoken test, not necessarily a conscious one, but a revealing one. The avoidant pulls back, and suddenly the entire dynamic becomes visible. Does the other person panic? Do they abandon their standards? Do they overextend themselves in order to restore closeness? Or do they remain connected to their own value regardless of what happens next? Self-respect changes the outcome of these moments completely. Instead of scrambling to regain certainty, the self-respecting person remains grounded. They continue living their life, they continue honoring their needs. They remain open to connection, but they do not sacrifice themselves in pursuit of it. This creates a powerful contrast because it demonstrates emotional independence in real time. The avoidant begins realizing that this person cannot be controlled by uncertainty. They cannot be endlessly pulled into cycles of chasing and reassurance. Their self-worth remains intact even when circumstances become unclear. And that realization often marks the beginning of something significant. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant is no longer interacting with someone who fears losing the relationship more than losing themselves. They are interacting with someone who understands that no relationship, no matter how meaningful, is worth abandoning their own self-respect. And that understanding changes everything. Once a person reaches that point, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. They become much harder to manipulate, not because they have become cold, but because clarity has replaced confusion. One of the biggest sources of emotional pain in avoidant dynamics is mixed signals. A moment of closeness followed by distance, a burst of affection followed by silence. Promises that seem sincere but are never fully matched by consistent action. When someone lacks self-respect, they often spend enormous amounts of energy trying to decode these contradictions. They search for hidden meanings. They analyze every interaction. They convince themselves that if they can just understand the behavior, they will finally feel secure. But self-respect introduces a different perspective. Instead of becoming trapped in endless interpretation, it pays attention to reality. It understands that consistency matters. It understands that actions matter. It understands that emotional uncertainty should not become a permanent lifestyle. This does not mean becoming cynical. It means becoming clear. The self-respecting person stops negotiating with obvious patterns, they stop explaining away every disappointment, they stop accepting confusion as a substitute for commitment, and when this shift occurs, the avoidant often notices it immediately. Suddenly they are dealing with someone who cannot be endlessly influenced by ambiguity, someone who is willing to acknowledge what is happening instead of chasing what might happen. That level of clarity changes the entire dynamic because manipulation, whether intentional or unintentional, loses its power when the other person refuses to abandon reality. This clarity also reveals an important distinction that many avoidants are extraordinarily sensitive to: the difference between need and desire. At first glance, the two can appear almost identical. Both involve attraction, both involve attachment, both involve wanting another person in your life. Yet emotionally, they create very different experiences. Need carries pressure. Need often communicates that another person's presence has become responsible for your emotional stability. Desire, on the other hand, carries freedom. It says, I want you in my life, but I do not require you in order to feel whole. Avoidants often respond more positively to desire because it feels safer. It allows room for connection without creating the sensation of emotional responsibility for another person's identity or happiness. This is where self-respect becomes incredibly attractive. It transforms attachment from dependence into choice. The self-respecting person does not love from a place of scarcity. They do not approach relationships as though this connection is their only chance to feel complete. Instead, they bring fullness into the relationship. They contribute rather than cling. They choose rather than grasp. And that energy feels entirely different. It removes the invisible pressure that often triggers avoidant defenses. The relationship begins feeling like a space where two independent people are sharing their lives rather than one person desperately trying to secure their worth through another. That distinction may seem subtle, but psychologically it changes everything. As this transformation deepens, silence starts taking on a new meaning. Most people associate silence with fear. They fear silence after an argument. They fear silence after distance appears. They fear silence because they assume it means something is wrong. This is why so many people rush to fill every gap with explanations, reassurances, and attempts to reconnect. But self-respecting silence is different. It is not a strategy, it is not a game, it is not designed to provoke a reaction. It is the natural result of trusting yourself enough not to force outcomes. When an avoidant pulls away, many people instinctively chase because they are trying to eliminate uncertainty. The self-respecting person does something different. They allow reality to reveal itself. They stop trying to control what cannot be controlled. They stop forcing clarity from someone who is unwilling to provide it. And in that silence, something fascinating often happens. The relationship begins exposing its true condition. Genuine interest moves toward connection. Genuine effort becomes visible. Genuine investment reveals itself without needing to be extracted. Silence becomes powerful because it removes interference. It allows both people to demonstrate who they truly are. For the avoidant, this can be surprisingly impactful because they are no longer being pursued. They are no longer responding to pressure. They are simply facing the reality of the connection itself. And reality has a way of becoming much clearer when nobody is constantly trying to manage it. This often leads to a moment that catches many avoidants off guard. It is the day they realize you are not waiting, not in an angry way, not in a performative way, not in a way designed to make them jealous. They simply realize that your life has continued moving forward. Your happiness is no longer suspended while they decide what they want. Your identity is no longer wrapped around the outcome of the relationship. For someone accustomed to emotional pursuit, this realization can be surprisingly significant. Many avoidants unconsciously assume access will always remain available, not because they are arrogant, but because patterns create expectations. If someone has consistently chased, reassured, and remained emotionally on standby, it becomes easy to assume that dynamic will continue indefinitely. Then one day it doesn't. The self-respecting person is still kind, still caring, still open to genuine connection, but they are no longer waiting for permission to live their life. They are no longer organizing their emotional world around someone else's uncertainty. And this creates a shift that is difficult to ignore. The avoidant begins realizing that access is not guaranteed. The relationship is no longer being held together by one person's persistence. It must now survive on mutual investment. That realization often creates a level of seriousness that endless pursuit never could. because people tend to value things differently when they understand those things are choices rather than certainties. And perhaps this is why standards are so powerful. Standards are not demands imposed on other people. They are commitments made to yourself. They define what kind of treatment aligns with your values and what kind of treatment does not. People with low self-respect often view standards as risky because they fear losing opportunities for connection. People with strong self-respect understand something different. They understand that standards do not reduce healthy relationships. They filter unhealthy ones. This is especially important with avoidance because standards create an environment where respect becomes necessary rather than optional. The self-respecting person is not threatening to leave. They are simply unwilling to remain in situations that consistently violate their emotional well-being. This mindset changes attraction in profound ways. It communicates value without ever needing to announce it. It shows that the relationship matters, but not more than personal integrity. It demonstrates that love is welcome, but not at the cost of self-abandonment. And when an avoidant encounters someone living from this place, they often experience something they rarely encounter. They meet a person whose boundaries are not built from fear, whose standards are not built from ego, and whose self-worth does not depend on being chosen. That combination creates a presence that is incredibly difficult to overlook, because true self-respect does not ask to be taken seriously. It naturally becomes impossible not to take seriously. And what makes that presence so powerful is that it is rooted in a kind of confidence that no longer needs attention to survive. This is one of the final shifts that separates genuine self-respect from performative self-worth. Many people appear confident when things are going well. They feel secure when they are receiving attention, validation, affection, and reassurance. But the moment those things disappear, so does their confidence. That is not confidence. That is dependence wearing confidence clothes. True self-respect operates differently. It remains intact whether attention is present or absent. It does not require constant proof. It does not demand continuous affirmation. It exists quietly beneath the surface as a stable understanding of personal value. Avoidants often notice this more than people realize because they spend much of their lives observing emotional pressure. They are highly sensitive to situations where someone seems dependent on their responses for emotional stability. When they encounter a person whose confidence is not built on external validation, it feels different. There is less tension, less urgency, less emotional weight. The relationship becomes a space where connection can grow naturally rather than a place where one person is constantly trying to secure reassurance from the other. This kind of quiet confidence is rarely loud or dramatic. It does not need to prove itself. And because it is authentic, it tends to create a level of respect that no amount of attention-seeking ever could. Eventually, if the avoidant begins taking the relationship seriously, certain changes often start becoming visible. Not because they have suddenly become a different person, but because respect naturally influences behavior. One of the clearest signs is effort. When someone truly values a connection, they begin contributing to it more consistently. Communication becomes less confusing. Curiosity increases. Follow-through improves. The avoidant starts showing a greater willingness to meet the relationship halfway. This does not mean perfection. It does not mean all fears instantly disappear, but it does mean the relationship begins feeling less one-sided. What is important to understand is that these changes rarely emerge because someone chased harder. They emerge because the dynamic changed. The avoidant stopped experiencing the relationship as something that would continue regardless of their investment. They began recognizing that meaningful connections require participation. Self-respect often creates this realization because it removes the safety net of endless accommodation. The relationship can no longer survive solely on one person's patience. It now requires mutual effort. And when an avoidant genuinely values someone who possesses strong self-respect, they often begin showing it through actions rather than promises. Their seriousness becomes visible through consistency. Their interest becomes visible through initiative. Their respect becomes visible through behavior. Because respect that exists only in words is rarely respect at all. At this point, however, it is important to confront a trap that catches many people along the way. Once they learn that self-respect can change relationship dynamics, they start treating it like a strategy. They begin setting boundaries they do not actually believe in. They create distance they secretly hope will provoke pursuit. They act independent while desperately monitoring whether the avoidant notices. On the surface, it may look like self-respect. Underneath, it is still driven by the same desire for validation. The focus remains on controlling another person's reaction rather than strengthening one's own relationship with oneself. Avoidants are often more perceptive about this than people assume. They may not identify it consciously, but they can usually sense when behavior feels performative. Authentic self-respect does not need an audience. It does not require someone else to acknowledge it in order to exist. It is not a tactic designed to produce a specific outcome. It is a way of living. The moment self-respect becomes a strategy, it loses much of its power because the underlying motivation has not actually changed. The person is still organizing their behavior around another person's response. Genuine growth occurs when the focus shifts away from manipulating outcomes and toward building a life that remains meaningful regardless of those outcomes. That is when self-respect becomes real, and ironically, that is also when it becomes most attractive. As this deeper form of self-respect develops, something unexpected begins happening to the relationship itself. The dynamic changes because the person has changed. So many people spend years trying to alter another person's behavior without realizing that relationships are systems. When one part of the system changes, the entire system responds. The self-respecting person no longer participates in the same emotional dances. They do not chase uncertainty the way they once did. They do not ignore red flags the way they once did. They do not sacrifice their needs in order to maintain access to the relationship. This creates a completely different environment. Power struggles start losing their fuel. Emotional games become less effective. The connection either evolves into something healthier or reveals limitations that were previously hidden beneath endless effort. Either way, clarity emerges, and clarity is one of the greatest gifts self-respect provides. It removes illusion, it removes confusion. It allows people to see relationships as they actually are rather than as they desperately hope they will become. This is why personal growth often transforms relationships in ways that no amount of persuasion ever could. The external dynamic shifts because the internal foundation has shifted first. What once felt chaotic starts feeling clearer. What once felt consuming starts feeling manageable. And what once felt impossible to understand begins making sense. Which brings us to the deeper truth hidden underneath this entire conversation. The ultimate purpose of self-respect is not making an avoidant choose you. It is not making them miss you. It is not making them chase you. Those outcomes may happen in some situations, but they are not the point. The point is reclaiming your relationship with yourself, because the moment self-respect becomes genuine, something extraordinary happens. Your worth stops rising and falling based on another person's availability. Their confusion no longer becomes your confusion. Their uncertainty no longer becomes your identity. Their inability to choose no longer feels like proof that you are not enough. You begin understanding something that many people spend years trying to learn. Another person's behavior can affect your life without defining your value. And once that realization settles in, you become different. You love differently. You communicate differently. You make decisions differently. You stop approaching relationships from fear and start approaching them from wholeness. That is the self-respect that makes avoidance take you seriously. Not because it forces them to see your value, but because it allows you to see your value whether they do or not. And in the end, that is what changes everything. Because when your worth is no longer dependent on being chosen, you stop chasing validation and start attracting respect. And that is the moment you become impossible to overlook, not only in the eyes of an avoidant, but in your own eyes as well.